the life of Prophet Muhammad told like a movie. In the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, nestled among arid mountains and sun-baked sands, lay the ancient city of Mecca, a place of merchants, mystics, and tribal power. The year was 570 CE, a time later known among the Arabs as the Year of the Elephant. It was a year remembered not only for the failed invasion of Mecca by Abraha and his mighty war elephants, but for the silent birth of a man who would change the course of human history. Under the stillness of a starlit night, Amina bint Wahab gave birth to a boy who would be named Muhammad, which means the Praised One. His father, Abdullah, had passed away before his son ever took a breath. Amina had carried him alone, wrapped in a quiet dignity that few could comprehend. She had known in her heart that this child was different. There were whispers of dreams she had seen, of a light that radiated from her womb, of a voice that told her this child would be a great protector of his people. While the world outside bustled with trade caravans and tribal rivalries, inside the humble quarters of Amina's home, a light was born, quiet and radiant, not yet ready to declare itself to the world. From the moment he entered life, Muhammad carried with him a presence that stirred the soul. His grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, held the infant in his arms and named him with reverence, feeling something profound stirred deep within him. The name Muhammad was uncommon among the Quraysh, the powerful tribe to which they belonged, but Abdul Muttalib insisted. "I want him to be praised in the heavens and on earth," he said. And indeed, one day, he would be. The young Muhammad's earliest days were spent in the care of a wet nurse named Halima Sa'diya from the Banu Sa'd tribe. It was customary for noble Arab families to send their children to the desert in their infancy, to be raised in purity and strength, away from the city's noise. Halima would later recall that the moment she took Muhammad into her care, blessings began to rain upon her impoverished household. Her once weak donkey galloped with newfound energy. Her dry breasts flowed with milk. Her goat, previously barren, gave plentifully. She came to understand that this child was no ordinary infant. There was divine favor in his presence. As Muhammad grew, even in those early years, there was a quiet strength about him. He was not boisterous like other boys, nor was he prone to mischief. He seemed contemplative, watchful, aware of the world in a way that exceeded his age. People noticed his gentleness, the calm in his eyes, the honesty in his words. By the age of 6, tragedy struck again. Amina fell ill during a return journey from Yathrib and passed away, leaving Muhammad orphaned. He was now a boy without mother or father, entrusted to the mercy of his family and the will of God. His grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, took him in once more, embracing the boy with fierce love and protection. But fate, unrelenting in its trials, soon called Abdul Muttalib to the grave. Now 8 years old, Muhammad was passed into the care of his uncle, Abu Talib, a man of modest means but deep loyalty. Despite his poverty, Abu Talib raised Muhammad with unwavering devotion, protecting him from harm and giving him the shelter of love and security. As Muhammad matured, the people of Mecca began to recognize something extraordinary about the boy. In a city steeped in polytheism, where tribal allegiance and material wealth defined status, Muhammad stood apart. He spoke little but listened deeply. He worked humbly, tending sheep and later joining his uncle on trade caravans, experiencing the wider world and watching closely the character of those he met. He never bowed before idols, he never uttered a lie. And though still a youth, he carried himself with a nobility that inspired trust. There were moments when travelers and sages would look into the eyes of the boy and pause, as if sensing an echo of prophecies long held in their hearts. He did not yet know the full weight of his destiny, but it had begun to stir within him. The boy who had lost everything, his father, his mother, his grandfather, had never lost his grace. And in the silence of his trials, the foundation was being laid for a message that would soon shake empires, awaken hearts, and forever change the world. This was no ordinary birth. It was the arrival of mercy, clothed in humility, destined to illuminate the darkest corners of the earth. The desert had waited long enough. The final prophet had come. The sun blazed over the city of Mecca, casting long shadows through the narrow streets where merchants shouted their wares and caravans came and went with the rhythm of the desert. Among the bustling trade routes and sacred traditions stood a young man, tall and modest, with a presence so steady it seemed to quiet the chaos around him. His name was Muhammad, and though he was not yet a prophet, his reputation had already begun to stretch beyond the borders of his tribe. In a city where deceit was common and ambition often clouded judgment, Muhammad was known by a title that needed no explanation: Al-Amin, the trustworthy. From a young age, Muhammad had worked to support his family, tending sheep in the rocky hills outside Mecca. The solitude of the desert shaped him, offering moments of reflection and insight. It was in those quiet hours, under the vast Arabian sky, that he learned patience, resilience, and empathy. He saw how even the smallest creature was a part of something greater. When he returned to the city, these lessons remained with him, guiding his interactions with people of every station. As he entered adulthood, Muhammad began to engage in trade, a crucial part of Meccan society. But unlike many others, he did not cut corners or chase profit at the expense of ethics. When he entered the marketplace, there was no bargaining through false claims, no hidden tricks or exaggerated promises. He spoke with clarity, delivered on his word, and honored every agreement. Customers began to seek him out, not only for the goods he sold, but for the peace of mind they felt when dealing with him. His honesty became his currency, and it enriched him in ways gold never could. There were times when others tried to take advantage of his gentle nature, assuming his kindness was weakness. But Muhammad was not naive. He saw through deceit, yet chose not to repay cruelty with cruelty. He held his dignity like a shield, strong yet graceful. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. His voice, neither harsh nor boastful, carried the weight of truth and the warmth of sincerity. In a society driven by pride and power, his humility stood as a quiet rebellion. Despite his growing success, Muhammad remained deeply grounded. He never mocked the poor, nor did he elevate himself above others. He sat with orphans and strangers, shared meals with the needy, and walked alongside slaves and merchants alike. His life was not built in palaces or decorated with excess, but in the hearts of those who trusted him. Even those who disagreed with his views respected his character. To them, he was a rare soul, untainted by the moral decay that surrounded him. The elders of Mecca began to turn to him in moments of dispute. His judgment was fair, his mind clear, and his heart free from bias. When a conflict arose over who would place the sacred black stone during the reconstruction of the Kaaba, it was Muhammad who was chosen to resolve it. With wisdom beyond his years, he proposed a solution that satisfied every tribe and preserved the fragile peace of the city. At that moment, even the proudest chieftains acknowledged that this young man possessed a kind of leadership that could not be bought or inherited. He lived with a quiet strength, working in the shadows of mountains and the folds of everyday life, yet leaving footprints of integrity wherever he walked. Muhammad's honesty was not an act, but a reflection of his soul, transparent, unwavering, and deeply rooted in something unseen but profoundly felt. Though he had not yet received revelation, those who truly observed him could sense that his path was unlike any other. A storm was coming, not of destruction, but of truth. And the young man called Al-Amin was already walking at its center. In a world where marriages were often transactions and love was rarely spoken of with tenderness, the story of Muhammad and Khadija, unfolded like a sacred melody whispered across time. She was a woman of wealth, independence, and wisdom, respected by men and admired by women in a society that offered little to either. Twice widowed, yet not broken, Khadija bint Khuwailid had built a thriving business that reached into the far corners of Arabia. Her caravans brought not just goods, but stories and information from distant lands. Her mind was sharp, her heart discerning, and her standards unmatched. When she heard of a young man named Muhammad, whose honesty in trade was drawing attention throughout Mecca, she became curious. He had no fortune of his own, no powerful status to lean upon, but the name Al-Amin preceded him like a gentle wind before the rain. It was said that he never cheated, never lied, and never allowed injustice to pass without resistance. He had a quiet nobility that defied the noise of the marketplace. And so, Khadija sent for him, not to flatter him, but to test him. She offered him a position in her trading business, asking him to lead one of her caravans to Syria, a journey fraught with difficulty and risk. Muhammad accepted, not because he sought status, but because he saw in the opportunity a chance to serve with integrity and to provide for those he loved. He completed the journey with such care, success, and trustworthiness that even Khadija's servant who accompanied him returned full of praise. He spoke of Muhammad's fairness, his humility, and his refusal to act indecently even when given the chance. There was something different about this man, something timeless. Khadija listened, and her heart stirred in a way it never had before. She had known many men, but none like him. His character wasn't a mask, it was the essence of who he was. He didn't speak to impress, didn't boast of his deeds, didn't seek to charm. He simply lived with truth. In the stillness of her thoughts, Khadija made a decision that would echo through eternity. She sent a proposal of marriage, not through direct words, but through trusted intermediaries who conveyed her interest with grace. And when Muhammad received the proposal, he was moved not by ambition or convenience, but by the sincerity and dignity of the woman who offered it. He agreed, and at the age of 25, Muhammad married the 40-year-old Khadija. It was not a marriage of power, nor was it one of political convenience. It was a union rooted in faith, love, and the meeting of two kindred spirits who had waited a lifetime to find one another. Their home was filled not with riches, but with warmth. Their hearts, not their possessions, defined their wealth. In Khadija, Muhammad found a partner who saw the man beyond the silence, who believed in him when the world had yet to understand his mission. Years passed, and the love between them only deepened. They raised children together, shared meals, laughed, cried, and supported one another through both calm and storm. Muhammad never took another wife during Khadija's lifetime, though it was customary among his people to do so. Her presence filled every corner of his heart. When revelations later descended upon him and fear gripped his soul after his first encounter with the angel, it was Khadija who wrapped him in her arms and whispered courage into his bones. "God would never disgrace you," she said. "You help the poor, you care for the orphan, you speak the truth. You are a man of honor." Her words became his foundation. Her faith in him lit the path ahead. When she passed away many years later, a silence fell over Muhammad that even the Quraysh could not provoke. Her absence was a wound no battle could inflict. Long after her death, he would speak of her with a softness that time never hardened. "She believed in me when no one else did," he once said. "She supported me when the world turned away." And though he would face many trials ahead, wars, betrayals, losses, it was the memory of Khadija's unwavering love that remained a source of strength through every storm. Theirs was not just a love story, it was a divine chapter in the unfolding of prophecy. In a world often harsh and unjust, they had found in each other a sanctuary, a bond that surpassed age, status, and expectation. A love beyond time, written not in poems or grand displays, but in quiet moments of faith, sacrifice, and devotion. The stillness of the cave wrapped around him like a cloak. Far above the city of Mecca, away from the clamor of the markets and the restless struggles of the tribes, Muhammad sat alone inside the rocky mouth of Hira. The cave was narrow and dark, carved by centuries of wind and silence, but for him, it was a refuge. Here, beneath the vast Arabian sky, with stars like watchful eyes overhead, he sought answers to the questions that burned within him. There was something deeply wrong with the world below. Injustice ruled the streets, idols stood in the Kaaba as lifeless kings, and the poor were trampled while the proud raised their banners high. His soul yearned for something pure, something that would fill the hollow spaces in people's hearts. And so he came to the cave, night after night, year after year, in search of meaning, of truth, of God. He brought only what he needed: dates, water, and solitude. Sometimes he stayed for days, sometimes longer. In those moments of reflection, he wept for his people, prayed in the way of his forefather Abraham, and listened, not with his ears, but with something deeper. The silence of the mountains spoke to him. The wind carried whispers he could not yet understand. His heart trembled not with fear, but with anticipation. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then, on one night unlike any other, everything changed. The night was quiet at first, like so many before it. He sat, wrapped in his cloak, lost in contemplation. But then, without warning, the cave was filled with an overwhelming presence, something unlike anything he had ever known. Light, but not the kind from fire. Power, but not of this world. And then, a voice that struck his soul with the weight of 1,000 truths, a voice that shook the mountain and stilled time. Read. He froze, terrified. He could not speak. I am not of those who read, he managed to stammer, his heart pounding like a drum. The presence drew closer, wrapping itself around him. He felt it, not with his skin, but with his very soul. The command came again, more urgent, more immense. Read! His breath caught. What was this? Who was this? Again he replied, trembling, I cannot read. A third time the command came, fierce and undeniable. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Read, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he did not know. And in that moment, the words poured into him like fire and light, engraving themselves into his memory. He gasped, eyes wide, chest heaving. The presence released him, and he stumbled out of the cave, his heart beating like a bird in a storm. The stars above seemed to pulse with knowing. The wind whispered differently now. He ran down the mountain, stumbling, falling, then rising again, his cloak whipping behind him. He didn't stop. His only thought was to reach her. Khadija. She would understand. She had to understand. When he finally burst through the door of his home, his face pale, his body shaking, Khadija rushed to him, her eyes full of worry. Cover me, he whispered. Cover me. She wrapped him in blankets and held him close, waiting as his body trembled and his breath came in gasps. She didn't question him. She didn't doubt him. She waited, steady and loving, until the storm within him calmed enough for him to speak. And then he told her. About the cave, about the angel, about the command, about the words that burned into his being. And with every sentence, Khadija's eyes softened, not with disbelief, but with reverence. She saw not a man gone mad, but a man who had been chosen. She embraced his truth before the world would even hear it. She took his hand and led him to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, a learned man of the scriptures. Waraka listened, his eyes narrowing with intensity. Then, with a trembling voice, he confirmed what Khadija had already believed. This is the same one who came to Moses, the angel of revelation. You are the one who has been foretold. But then a shadow crossed Waraka's face. They will turn against you, he said solemnly. They will drive you out. No man has come with what you bring without being opposed. Muhammad listened, his heart heavy with the weight of prophecy. He had asked for truth. Now he carried it, and it would not come without pain. The days that followed were filled with silence. He waited for the angel to return, unsure, afraid, overwhelmed. But the flame had already been lit. The heavens had spoken. The cave had given birth to a revelation that would reshape the earth. And in the heart of a humble man, the voice of God had found its vessel. The world would never be the same again. In the quiet corners of Mecca, far from the public eye and the thunder of the city's merchants and chieftains, a small flame began to burn. It was not loud or confrontational, not yet a call to arms or rebellion. It was a whisper, gentle, deliberate, and profound. After the shattering experience in the cave and the first revelations from the angel Gabriel, Muhammad began to understand that he was not only chosen, but commanded. The message was not meant to be his alone. It was to be shared, but not all at once, and not yet in the open. For now, it was a secret call, one soul at a time. His heart was still adjusting to the weight of divine words. The revelations would come in moments of silence or waves of power that left him trembling. Each verse was a key, unlocking ancient truths that the people had long forgotten. And though he had no scroll, no temple, no crown, what he carried in his heart would one day shape the conscience of nations. He began with those closest to him, those whose hearts were already open. Khadija, his beloved wife, was the first to believe. Her acceptance gave him strength like no other. Then came Ali ibn Abi Talib, his young cousin, just a boy, but filled with courage and sharpness far beyond his years. Without hesitation, Ali accepted the message and stood beside Muhammad, even as the world around them remained unaware. Zayd ibn Haritha, once a slave, but now a beloved adopted son, was next. He too embraced the message without doubt. Then Abu Bakr, the trusted friend, a man of means and reputation, heard the call and answered it with the steadiness of a mountain. Abu Bakr's belief would soon bring others into the fold. Quietly, discreetly, merchants, slaves, seekers of truth, people forgotten by the elite but precious in the eyes of God. They met in secret in the house of Al-Arqam, a discreet home tucked away from the scrutiny of the Quraysh. There, the verses of the Quran were recited for the first time in hushed tones and trembling voices. The words flowed like water, cutting through pride, greed, and despair. Those who heard them wept, not from fear, but from recognition. It was as if their souls had been waiting for this moment all along. They knew these words were not the speech of men. They were something else, heavenly, urgent, alive. The number of believers began to grow, still hidden in the folds of Mecca's shadows. They were taught not only to believe in one God, but to stand for justice, to care for the orphan and the widow, to treat slaves as brothers, and to shun the idols carved by their own hands. It was a radical message, though delivered in whispers. It offered no riches, no power, only truth. And for those who accepted it, that was enough. But secrecy could not last forever. Whispers turn into echoes. And soon, the Quraysh began to suspect that something was stirring beneath the surface of their city. Their poets had not spoken such words. Their priests had not delivered such clarity. Who was this man changing hearts in silence? For now, Muhammad continued his mission with patience and care. He knew the storm would come, but the roots of faith had to be planted deep before the winds arrived. The secret call was not about numbers or spectacle. It was about conviction. It was about building a core of believers whose hearts would remain unshaken when the earth beneath them trembled. In the stillness of those early days, something extraordinary was taking shape. A new dawn was beginning, not with trumpets, but with tears, not in palaces, but in humble homes. It was in the hearts of a small group of men and women bound by truth that the greatest transformation in human history had quietly begun. 3 years had passed since the first quiet whispers of revelation filled the shadows of Mecca. What began in secret had now taken root in the hearts of a few brave souls. Men and women who, against the tide of their own society, believed in one God and in the message brought by a man who had once been known simply as Al-Amin. But faith cannot remain hidden forever. Truth, by its very nature, demands light. And so the command came down, clear and unmistakable. Rise and warn your people. Proclaim openly what you were once told in silence. The moment had arrived. Muhammad stood upon Mount Safa, a rocky hill near the Kaaba, a place known for declarations and calls to action. He called out to the clans of Quraysh by name, his own people, his own blood. They gathered, intrigued, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. Here was a man they had never known to lie, never known to deceive. He stood before them not as a poet or a madman, but with a clarity that pierced the noise of the city. "If I were to tell you that an enemy was approaching from behind this hill, would you believe me?" he asked. They nodded. "We have never known you to lie," they said. "Then know," he continued, "that I am a warner to you before a great punishment. I call you to worship none but God, to leave behind your idols, your arrogance and your injustice. Save yourselves from a fire whose fuel is men and stones." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Some lowered their eyes, others whispered among themselves. But one voice broke the stillness with fury. Abu Lahab, his own uncle. "May you be ruined for this. Is this what you gathered us for?" he spat. And with that, the atmosphere shifted. The seed of opposition had been planted. The public invitation changed everything. What had once been dismissed as a harmless spiritual curiosity was now seen as a threat, a challenge to the very fabric of Meccan society. The Quraysh prided themselves on tradition, lineage and control. Their wealth flowed from pilgrims who came to bow before idols. Their power rested on the illusion that the gods they worshipped were the protectors of fortune and family. And now, one of their own was declaring those gods to be false. The mockery began first. Poets ridiculed him, calling him a sorcerer, a madman, a liar. Children were taught to throw stones as he passed. The leaders of Mecca sent envoys to Khadijah, hoping she would speak sense into her husband. When that failed, they went to Abu Talib, demanding he silence his nephew. But the old man, though he did not yet share Muhammad's faith, stood firm in his protection. And so the threats became more cruel. Slaves who accepted Islam were tortured in public. Bilal, the Abyssinian, was dragged through the streets, beaten and crushed beneath a heavy stone as he cried out in defiance, "Ahad, Ahad, one, one." Sumaya, a woman of great faith and no protection, became the first martyr, killed with a spear for refusing to recant. Families disowned their sons. Mothers wept as their daughters were cast out. Believers prayed in secret or fled the city under the cover of night. Yet, the more they were attacked, the more their faith grew. It was not stubbornness or delusion. It was a deep, burning certainty that they had touched truth and could never return to what they once believed. The Quran continued to descend, verse by verse, each line strengthening their hearts and sharpening their understanding. The words were not just poetry, they were revelation, raw, majestic, and untamed. Muhammad bore the storm with a patience that astounded even his enemies. He never cursed those who cursed him, never raised his hand in retaliation. He walked the same streets, spoke with the same gentleness, prayed with the same devotion. His eyes often filled with tears, not for himself, but for those who rejected the mercy offered to them. And in the midst of rising threats and growing tension, one thing became clear. The open call had begun a battle, not just of beliefs, but of souls. The path ahead would be long, filled with trials that would test every ounce of faith. But there was no turning back. The truth had been spoken. The idols trembled. And the world, though it did not yet know it, was beginning to change forever. The city of Mecca had grown colder, not in temperature but in spirit. The streets, once filled with curiosity about the Prophet's message, now echoed with resentment. The Quraysh, leaders of the dominant tribes, had tried persuasion, ridicule, threats, and cruelty, but still, the message spread. Islam continued to take root in places they never expected, in the hearts of slaves, of the poor, of the young, even among members of their own families. Every effort to stamp it out had only fanned its flame. In desperation, they turned to a darker weapon: social suffocation. They crafted a pact, sealed and placed within the Kaaba, announcing a complete boycott of the Prophet Muhammad, his followers, and his entire clan, the Banu Hashim. No one was to marry from them, buy from them, sell to them, visit them, or show them kindness. It was a calculated cruelty designed not just to punish, but to isolate and starve. The Quraysh hoped to force Abu Talib, the Prophet's aging uncle and chief protector, into surrendering his nephew to their will. But Abu Talib refused, and with him the entire clan stood firm, even those who did not follow the new faith. Banished to the narrow valley of Abu Talib, they were surrounded on all sides by steep rock and betrayal. The scorching sun bore down by day, and the cold winds of the desert cut through the night. Food grew scarce, water even more so. The cries of children echoed through the canyon, their bellies empty, their mothers helpless. Leaves and roots were eaten to survive. Leather was boiled. Traders who tried to send supplies were intercepted or threatened. And yet, within that confinement, faith endured. The believers prayed in the darkness, whispered verses beneath the moonlight, and held each other with the strength that only purpose could offer. Outside, some among the Quraysh began to question the pact's cruelty. They saw children reduced to skin and bone, heard stories of infants dying in their mothers' arms. A few brave hearts, men of conscience, began to voice their disapproval. Eventually, cracks began to form in the wall of oppression. Then, one day, the Prophet told them that the document hanging in the Kaaba had been eaten by insects, leaving only the words, "In your name, O God." The Quraysh checked and found it just as he had said. It was the final sign they could not deny. The boycott, after nearly 3 unbearable years, was broken. But the suffering had taken its toll. Just as the believers returned to their homes, worn and weary, death knocked at the Prophet's door. First came the loss of Abu Talib. The old man, who had stood like a wall between Muhammad and his enemies for over 40 years, was gone. Without him, the Prophet stood exposed. The Quraysh, who had once held back out of respect, now saw an opening. They mocked him in the streets, threw filth in his path, even attempted to harm him physically. But the greatest blow had yet to come. Only weeks after Abu Talib's passing, Khadija fell ill. Her strength had sustained them all through hunger and exile, but her body had grown thin, her face pale. Muhammad watched over her, his heart breaking in silence. This was the woman who had believed in him when no one else did, who had spent her wealth for the sake of his mission, who had held him through his fear and stood by him in every storm. He had never known love like hers, and he would never know it again. When she passed from this world, the light in his eyes dimmed. He wrapped her in the earth with his own hands, and for a long time he wept without words. That year became known as the Year of Sorrow, not just for the loss of two cherished companions, but for the shadow of loneliness that now followed him. Mecca, once his home, had become a place of pain. With every step, he was reminded of what he had lost. Yet, even in grief, he did not falter. The message still burned within him, and the mission still called. He would carry on, even if he had to walk alone. In the nights that followed, the prophet often stood in prayer, tears falling onto the stone beneath him, whispering to the one who had never abandoned him. Though the earth had grown heavy with sorrow, his eyes still looked to the heavens. And from that darkness, a new light would soon appear, one that would lift him from despair, one that would remind him that while the world below trembled, the heavens remained unshaken. But for now, he mourned, not as a prophet, but as a man, a husband, a nephew, a friend. And in his grief, the sincerity of his heart became a beacon for generations yet to come. In the midst of the prophet's sorrow, when grief still wrapped around his soul like a shroud, something miraculous happened. Something so divine, so otherworldly, that even those who believed found themselves breathless at its telling. It began not with warning or trumpet, but in the silence of the night, when the world was asleep and the heavens prepared a gift of hope. On a night like no other, as Muhammad lay in the home of his cousin, the roof seemed to split, and from above descended the archangel Gabriel, radiant and commanding. He brought with him a white, winged creature unlike anything the prophet had seen before, called Al-Buraq, a beast of celestial light and speed, larger than a donkey, smaller than a mule, with a stride that reached the farthest horizon. The prophet mounted the creature, and with Gabriel at his side, they soared into the night, faster than the blink of an eye, racing across the desert and hills, flying over cities and shadows, until they reached Jerusalem. There, in the sacred space known as Al-Aqsa, he stood among the ruins of ancient prophets. The same prophets whose names had echoed in his revelations, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, now gathered in spirit to pray behind him. It was not a dream, but something more profound. Time itself bent to accommodate what was unfolding. And then, the second part of the journey began. From Jerusalem, the prophet was taken higher, beyond clouds, past the stars, into realms that mortal eyes had never seen. Layer by layer, he ascended the 7 heavens. At each gate, Gabriel knocked and sought permission to enter, and at each gate, a prophet awaited. Adam greeted him in the first heaven, father of mankind, smiling with both joy and recognition. In the second, Yahya and Isa, John the Baptist and Jesus, welcomed him with brotherhood and warmth. In the third, he met Yusuf, Joseph, radiant in beauty. In the fourth stood Idris, the one lifted by God. The fifth held Harun, Aaron, and in the sixth, Musa, Moses, who wept not from envy, but from awe, knowing the ummah of Muhammad would be blessed beyond his own. And finally, in the 7th heaven, he met Abraham, leaning against the lote tree, the place where all knowledge ends, and only the Creator knows what lies beyond. It was here, in a realm where words fall short, that Muhammad was brought to the furthest limit, the Sidrat al-Muntaha. Beyond this point, not even Gabriel could pass. "If I take one more step," Gabriel said, "I would burn." And so the prophet went alone. In that moment, he stood before the presence of the Almighty. There were no eyes that saw, no ears that heard, no tongue that could fully describe what passed between them. But from this divine meeting came one of the greatest gifts ever given to humanity, the 5 daily prayers. Originally 50, they were reduced upon Moses' advice and the prophet's repeated return until they became 5, with the reward of 50. The descent was just as swift as the journey upward. Within the same night, the prophet returned to Mecca. He awoke in his bed, but his heart had traveled through the very fabric of the cosmos. When he told the people what had happened, most of them laughed. Some clapped their hands in disbelief. "You went to Jerusalem and came back in a single night?" they mocked. "Even our best caravan takes weeks." But Abu Bakr, upon hearing the tale, said without hesitation, "If he said it, then it is true." From that day on, he became known as As-Siddiq, the truthful one. For the prophet, the night journey was more than a miracle. It was a turning point. After the year of sorrow, after the pain of loss and rejection, the heavens had opened to remind him of his place, his mission, and the one who never left his side. It was reassurance that his journey was not in vain, that his footsteps, though burdened, were guided, and that beyond every hardship awaited a closeness to God that no grief could ever diminish. The night had not just brought a miracle, it had brought the prophet a glimpse of eternity. The hostility in Mecca had grown unbearable. With each passing day, the prophet and his followers faced mounting pressure, ridicule, and persecution. The boycott may have ended, but the bitterness remained. His message of monotheism threatened the very foundation upon which the Quraysh had built their pride and power. Though his patience endured and his compassion never wavered, it was clear that Mecca, the city of his birth, was becoming a place that could no longer offer refuge to the truth he carried. Still, he continued to preach, continued to call people to a higher path, even when they turned away or raised their fists in anger. In this storm of rejection, something unexpected happened. During the pilgrimage season, when tribes from across Arabia came to Mecca, the prophet would seek out strangers in the tents outside the city, inviting them to listen to the message of Islam. Most dismissed him, some insulted him, but one small group listened. They were from a city to the north, a place of date palms and fertile valleys known as Yathrib. Unlike the Quraysh, these men were not steeped in arrogance or idolatry. They were people wounded by tribal warfare, exhausted by generations of bloodshed between the Aus and Khazraj clans. They had heard from the Jews who lived among them that a prophet would soon arise. When Muhammad spoke, something in their hearts stirred. They recognized the truth in his words, the peace in his voice. That first year, 6 of them embraced Islam. They returned to Yathrib as quiet believers, carrying the message back to their families. The following year, 12 returned to meet the prophet again. At a place known as Al-Aqaba, under the cover of night, they pledged themselves to him, not just as followers of faith, but as protectors. They promised not to lie, not to steal, not to kill, and to obey him in what was right. The prophet, touched by their sincerity, sent with them a teacher, Mus'ab ibn Umayr, a young man of noble origin who had once lived in luxury but now walked barefoot in service of the message. Mus'ab's efforts in Yathrib bore fruit quickly. Entire families began embracing Islam. The hearts of that city, softened by suffering and division, were opening. A third and final meeting occurred the next year. 73 men and 2 women stood in the same secret place, pledging themselves not only in belief, but in action. They vowed to defend the prophet as they would defend their own families. They invited him to come to Yathrib, to make it his home, and to find in it the safety Mecca could no longer offer. The prophet listened with deep emotion. He saw in Yathrib not just a new city, but a new beginning, a place where his message could flourish freely, where unity could be forged, where justice and faith could be established. He told his followers in Mecca, many of whom had endured years of torment, that they could now begin to migrate. Quietly, in small groups, they slipped away from the city, leaving behind homes, wealth, and memories, seeking the promise of peace. For the prophet, however, the time had not yet come. He would wait for the command from his Lord, and the danger that still loomed in Mecca would not spare him. But in the distance beyond the scorching sands, a city waited. Yathrib, soon to be known as Medina, the city of the prophet, was preparing to embrace its destiny. And as the sun rose each day over its palm groves, it brought with it the hope of a new chapter, one written not in secrecy and fear, but in light and mercy. The seeds of a nation were being sown, not with swords or conquest, but with faith, trust, and the simple promise of a better tomorrow. The streets of Mecca grew darker with suspicion. The Quraysh, humiliated by the growing strength of the Prophet's message and the quiet exodus of his followers to Yathrib, now called Medina, realized that time was slipping from their grasp. No matter how many times they ridiculed, attacked, or conspired, the faith of Muhammad's followers only deepened. And now, he was being invited to lead an entire city, one that would protect him and defend his cause with their lives. They knew that if he left Mecca safely, they would lose their power, their control, and perhaps even their gods. So they came together in secret, plotting a final blow that would silence him forever. The plan was cruel in its precision. They would choose a strong young man from each clan, surround his home under cover of darkness, and strike at once, each delivering a single blow so that no one tribe could be held responsible. It would be swift, and it would be decisive. They gathered their swords and took their positions outside his house as the night deepened. But within those walls, Muhammad already knew what they had planned. Revelation had come, warning him of the danger, guiding him to act. Calmly, he asked his cousin Ali to lie in his bed, covered in his green cloak, while he himself slipped away into the shadows, unnoticed by the eyes that watched from the darkness. As he walked past them, dust in hand, he recited verses from the Quran. Not one of the would-be assassins saw him leave. He made his way to the house of Abu Bakr, his closest companion, who had long been preparing for this moment. They had 2 camels ready and a skilled guide who knew the lesser-known routes through the desert. But they did not head north toward Yathrib immediately. Instead, they went south toward the rugged terrain of Mount Thor, hiding in a cave to throw off any pursuers. There, in the cool and silent darkness, they waited for 3 days while the Quraysh scoured the region in fury. Search parties moved across the desert, offering rich rewards for Muhammad's capture, dead or alive. At one point, the search came so close that the men stood just outside the cave entrance. Abu Bakr's heart tightened in fear, not for himself, but for the Prophet beside him. "If they look down, they will see us," he whispered. But the Prophet, serene in his faith, turned to him and said, "Do not grieve. Indeed, Allah is with us." And indeed, they were protected. The cave's entrance, exposed and vulnerable, had been shielded not by soldiers or weapons, but by miracles. A spider had spun a web across the opening, and a dove had built a nest nearby. The searchers, seeing the undisturbed web and the peaceful dove, assumed the cave to be empty. They turned back, unaware that the man they hunted was just a few steps away, resting in the calm embrace of divine protection. When the danger had passed, the journey resumed. The path to Medina was long and harsh, cutting through barren lands scorched by the sun and whipped by desert winds. Yet each step carried them closer to hope. Along the way, they encountered a bounty hunter named Suraka, who had heard of the reward and came with sword in hand. But each time he tried to approach, his horse stumbled and sank into the sand. Realizing he was in the presence of something greater, Suraka begged for mercy and was granted it, the prophet even promising him the bracelets of the Persian king one day. Suraka turned back, not as an enemy, but as a man transformed. At long last, the journey ended on the outskirts of Medina. Word had spread, and the people waited in anticipation. Children climbed rooftops, women lined the streets, and men filled the pathways with eager eyes. When they finally saw him, walking in with dust on his sandals and peace in his eyes, joy erupted like the first rain after a long drought. Songs were sung, voices rose in praise, and hearts overflowed. The prophet had arrived, not as a conqueror, but as a guest, a leader, and a servant of God. The Hijra was not just a migration. It was the beginning of a new era. It marked the moment when faith found a home, when revelation was no longer silenced by oppression, and when a community was born, one united not by blood or tribe, but by belief, brotherhood, and the dream of a just and merciful world. Medina, once known as Yathrib, had become a city reborn. With the Prophet's arrival, the streets that had long been burdened by tribal feuds now breathed a new kind of air, one filled with hope, with structure, and with purpose. The people who had welcomed him were not merely offering shelter, they were seeking transformation. But for that transformation to take root, something more was needed than faith alone. Medina was home to many different groups. Muslim emigrants from Mecca, native converts from the AWs and Khazraj tribes, Jewish clans and others who still followed the old ways. Each had their own customs, their own grievances, their own fears. Left unattended, these differences could ignite once more into the kind of conflict that had ravaged the city for generations. Muhammad knew that unity could not be commanded, it had to be built. And so, he began the process of establishing a foundational agreement, one that would serve not just the Muslims, but the entire city. It would be more than a treaty. It would be a constitution, a covenant of coexistence. Carefully, thoughtfully, and with divine guidance, he crafted a document that would lay the groundwork for a new kind of society, one governed not by tribal vengeance or inherited power, but by justice, accountability, and shared responsibility. The Constitution of Medina, as it came to be known, declared that all inhabitants of the city, regardless of tribe or faith, were part of a single community. Each group retained its identity and autonomy, but agreed to defend the city together, to uphold mutual justice, and to resolve disputes through the Prophet's judgment. The document recognized the rights of the Jewish tribes as equal citizens, granting them freedom of religion and protection, so long as they honored the pact and lived in peace. The Muslims, both the emigrants and the locals, were bound together as brothers, no longer as separate factions. The message was clear. Allegiance was no longer to bloodlines or old wounds. It was to justice, truth, and the preservation of peace. This new framework brought immediate results. Acts of revenge were curtailed. Disputes were brought forward and resolved with fairness. No group was above the law, and no tribe held superiority over another. For the first time, Medina was more than a collection of rival clans. It was a community, a model for what a society could be when guided by principles rather than pride. The Prophet did not rule as a king. He walked among the people, listened to their concerns, and lived in a modest home near the mosque that he helped build with his own hands. He visited the sick, mediated quarrels, and prayed alongside those he led. His authority came not from fear, but from trust. People saw in him a man who did not seek power for himself, but who carried the burden of leadership with humility and purpose. His wisdom bridged differences, his fairness inspired loyalty, and his kindness softened even the hardest hearts. The Constitution of Medina would later be remembered as one of history's first written charters of pluralistic governance. It was not merely a political document, it was a reflection of prophetic insight, designed to harmonize a city of differences into a single, functioning society. It laid the groundwork for a civilization built on moral order, collective duty, and compassion. And so, Medina began to change, not through conquest or coercion, but through the steady rise of justice. The Prophet had not just found a home, he had helped create one where law, mercy, and brotherhood stood together, where belief translated into action, and where a city once divided had now become a beacon for what was to come. The call to faith was never meant to be a call to war, but the reality of truth is that it often threatens the comfort of falsehood. The Prophet had left Mecca in peace, but the Quraysh were not content to let him live in safety. Their pride had been wounded by his escape, and their trade threatened by his rising influence. They saw the growing Muslim community in Medina not as a neighbor, but as a danger. And so the drums of conflict began to beat, slowly at first, then louder, until the inevitable was upon them. The first battle came when the Muslims, still few in number and poorly armed, set out to intercept a Quraysh caravan. It was not an act of aggression, but a strategic effort to reclaim some of what had been stolen from them in Mecca. But the caravan escaped, and in its place, an army of 1,000 Quraysh warriors marched from Mecca, armed to the teeth and driven by vengeance. The Muslims numbered only around 300 and had only a few horses and camels between them. They camped near the wells of Badr, unsure of what the next dawn would bring. That night, the Prophet prayed under the stars, his hands raised, his voice trembling with sincerity as he begged his Lord for victory, not for his own sake, but for the future of the message. "If this small group is destroyed today," he cried, "there will be no one left to worship you on the earth." His companions, though outnumbered, stood firm. They had no illusions. They were not warriors by trade. They were farmers, merchants, refugees, but they were believers. When the sun rose over the desert, the two forces met in the sands of Badr. The battle was fierce, brief, and miraculous. Despite their weakness, the Muslims fought with a strength that seemed to come from beyond themselves. Angels, unseen by human eyes, descended upon the battlefield, and by the time the dust had settled, 70 of the Quraysh had fallen, including some of their most powerful leaders. The Muslims lost only 14. It was a victory that sent shockwaves through Arabia. The Quraysh had been humiliated. The believers rejoiced not in bloodshed, but in the confirmation that God's promise was true. But victory does not silence hatred. The Quraysh regrouped, their pride now stained with the memory of Badr. The following year they returned with a force of 3,000, determined to crush the Prophet and erase the memory of their defeat. The Muslims met them near Mount Uhud. This time they had grown in number, nearly 1,000 strong, and had taken strategic positions on the battlefield. The Prophet placed a group of archers on a hill, warning them never to leave their post, no matter what they saw. The battle began, and once again, the Muslims gained the upper hand. The Quraysh began to flee, and victory seemed close. But in the confusion, the archers saw the enemy retreating and believed the battle was over. They abandoned their position to gather the spoils of war, ignoring the Prophet's command. That moment of disobedience changed everything. Khalid ibn al-Walid, then a commander for the Quraysh, led a surprise cavalry attack from behind. Chaos erupted. Many Muslims were killed. The Prophet himself was injured, his face wounded, his tooth broken. Rumors spread that he had been killed, and despair gripped the hearts of the believers. But he lived. Blooded, battered, and surrounded by only a few loyal companions, he called out to his people, urging them to rally. Slowly, the Muslims regrouped, and the Quraysh, though victorious, failed to press their advantage. The battle ended in sorrow. 70 Muslims were martyred, including the Prophet's beloved uncle Hamza, whose body was mutilated in death. The lesson was bitter but clear. Victory comes with obedience, and even the smallest breach can bring great consequences. The pain of Uhud lingered, but the Muslims did not give up. Over the years, tensions simmered, alliances shifted, and threats loomed. Then came the greatest challenge yet. The Quraysh allied with other tribes and marched toward Medina with a force of 10,000 men. Their goal was simple: complete annihilation. The Muslims, vastly outnumbered, could not meet them in open combat. A new tactic was needed. At the suggestion of Salman the Persian, the Muslims dug a deep trench around the vulnerable parts of the city, a strategy unknown to Arabia at the time. The trench turned the tide. When the Quraysh arrived, they were stunned. Their cavalry could not cross. They camped outside the city for weeks, launching arrows and shouting threats. But the Muslims held their ground. The cold winds of winter cut through the camps. Food grew scarce. Tensions rose among the enemy ranks. God sent a storm so fierce that it tore through their tents and extinguished their fires. Disheartened and divided, the Confederate armies began to retreat. Not a single sword was raised in open battle that day, yet it was a victory as great as Badr. The Muslims had defended their city without losing their unity. These battles were more than clashes of swords. They were moments of truth, of faith, tested and deepened. Each one revealed the character of the Prophet, his patience, his courage, his mercy, even toward his enemies. And through it all, the Muslim community grew stronger, not just in number, but in conviction. The path of truth had never been promised to be easy, but with every trial, their hearts were forged, and the light they carried burned brighter against the darkness that tried to silence it. The city that had once cast him out ridiculed him, plotted his death, and waged war against his people, now lay ahead, its gates closed, its people waiting in anxious silence. It had been 8 years since the Prophet Muhammad left Mecca under the cover of darkness, pursued by assassins, with nothing but faith and a promise. In those years, Islam had grown from a persecuted belief to a powerful movement. Medina had flourished, alliances had shifted, victories had come. Yet, never once had the Prophet sought vengeance. His heart, even in strength, still longed for peace. The conquest of Mecca did not begin with swords, but with a treaty. 2 years earlier, at Hudaybiyah, the Prophet had signed a 10-year truce with the Quraysh. Though the terms seemed unequal and many of his followers were disappointed, he accepted them with patience, knowing that peace would open doors that battle never could. And it did. In that period of calm, people saw Islam not through the lens of conflict, but through the beauty of its teachings. Hundreds embraced the faith. The Quran continued to descend, and the community grew. But the peace was not to last. One of the Quraysh's allies violated the treaty by attacking a tribe allied with the Muslims. Blood was spilled in the night, and the cries of betrayal reached Medina. The Prophet sent a message to the Quraysh, giving them a chance to make amends, but they refused. The treaty was broken. The time had come. Yet even now, Muhammad did not seek destruction. He gathered an army of 10,000 strong, men who had once been outcasts, now united, disciplined, and guided by faith. As they marched toward Mecca, they did so without arrogance. The Prophet ordered no killing, no looting, no coercion. This was not to be a conquest of pride, but a return of truth to its rightful place. They approached quietly, setting up camp just outside the city. The Quraysh, overwhelmed and unprepared, sent Abu Sufyan, their aging leader and longtime adversary of the Prophet, to negotiate. What he saw astonished him. The campfires stretched far and wide. The discipline of the Muslim army, the reverence of the soldiers, and the mercy of the man they once called a madman, it shook him. He met the Prophet, and for the first time saw not just a rival, but a man whose truth could not be denied. That night, Abu Sufyan embraced Islam. The Prophet, knowing the fear that gripped the people of Mecca, declared that anyone who entered Abu Sufyan's house or stayed in their homes or sought refuge in the Kaaba would be safe. There would be no revenge. When the gates of Mecca opened the next morning, there was no resistance. The army entered in waves, not with raised swords, but with lowered heads. The Prophet rode not as a conqueror, but in humility, his forehead touching the back of his camel in gratitude to God. The people watched from behind their doors and rooftops, waiting for punishment, expecting the worst. But instead, they saw forgiveness walking through their streets. He made his way to the Kaaba, the sacred house that had been filled with idols for centuries. With his own hands, he struck them down, reciting, "Truth has come, and falsehood has vanished. Indeed, falsehood is bound to vanish." The idols fell one by one until none remained. The Kaaba stood pure once again, as it had in the time of Abraham. Then he turned to the people of Mecca, the same ones who had insulted him, attacked him, driven him into exile. They stood before him, their faces pale, their hearts pounding. He could have ordered their deaths. No one would have stopped him. But instead, he asked, "What do you think I will do with you today?" They responded, voices shaking, "You are a noble brother, the son of a noble brother." And then, in a voice filled with mercy, he said, "I say to you what Joseph said to his brothers. No blame will be upon you today. Go, for you are free." Tears flowed. Hearts that had once been hardened by pride and hatred now softened with awe. In that single moment, more people entered Islam than ever before, not because of a sword, not because of force, but because of mercy. The Prophet had shown them a forgiveness so profound, so undeserved, that it shattered every wall of resistance. The conquest of Mecca was not a tale of war, it was the triumph of compassion. It was the return of truth to its birthplace, not with vengeance, but with grace. And it was a reminder that true power does not lie in domination, but in the ability to forgive when you have every right to punish. In the heart of Mecca, beneath the shadow of the Kaaba, the Prophet stood not as a victor, but as a servant of God, and the world was changed forever. The sun rose high over the plain of Arafat, casting its golden light upon a sea of white garments that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was the 9th day of Dhul Hijjah, in the 10th year after the migration, and the Prophet Muhammad stood before the largest gathering he had ever addressed. Over 100,000 believers had come from every corner of Arabia, united in faith, gathered in peace, their hearts full of awe and love for the man who had guided them from darkness to light. This was his final pilgrimage, and though many did not know it yet, this would be his last sermon, a farewell not only to those present, but to all generations who would follow. He stood upon his camel, Al-Qaswa, while the voices around him stilled into silence. The desert wind blew gently, and the people leaned in to hear every word. The Prophet's voice was clear, steady, and filled with solemnity. He began by praising and thanking God, affirming the sacredness of the moment and the unity of the gathering. Then, with the authority of revelation and the tenderness of a father, he began to speak, not as a ruler, not as a general, but as a man who knew his time was near and whose heart overflowed with love and concern for his people. "O people, listen to my words, for I do not know whether I will ever meet you again after this year, in this place." The weight of those words settled heavily upon the crowd. eyes welled with tears. Some hands clasped in prayer, others gripped their chests. The prophet continued, reminding them of the sanctity of life, of blood, and of property. Just as this day, this month, and this city are sacred, so too are the lives and possessions of each one of you. He called them to justice, to the end of vengeance, to the protection of the weak. He spoke of the rights of women, urging men to treat them with kindness and respect, to honor the trust that God had placed in their hands. He reminded the people that they all came from a single soul, that no Arab is superior to a non-Arab, nor a white to a black, except by righteousness and good deeds. He shattered the walls of tribal arrogance with the truth of equality. All of you are from Adam, and Adam was from dust. The crowd listened, hearts beating in unison with a truth that transcended lineage and pride. The prophet reaffirmed the pillars of faith, prayer, fasting, charity, pilgrimage, and warned against the whispers of the devil, who still sought to divide and deceive. He told them to follow the Quran and his example, to hold fast to them so they would never go astray. I leave behind me two things, the Book of God and my Sunnah. If you follow them, you will never be lost. His words were not mere guidance, they were a legacy, a final trust. Then he raised his voice and asked, "Have I conveyed the message?" The crowd responded as one, "Yes, you have." And he lifted his hand to the sky and said, "O Allah, bear witness. O Allah, bear witness. O Allah, bear witness." The sun bore down, the winds whispered through the crowd, and a stillness fell, a sacred silence that would echo through history. It was here, during this farewell, that the final revelation descended. "This day I have perfected for you your religion, completed my favor upon you, and have chosen for you Islam as your religion." The mission was complete. The message had been delivered. The man who had once stood alone on Mount Safa was now surrounded by a nation of believers. The prophet looked out at them one last time, not as subjects, but as his beloved brothers and sisters. And though his body would one day leave the world, his words, his example, and his love would remain, guiding hearts across every land and every generation. In that moment, beneath the sky of Arafat, a chapter ended, but the light he had lit would never fade. The streets of Medina had grown quiet, their usual rhythm softened by an air of reverence. The Prophet Muhammad, once strong and tireless in his mission, had begun to show signs of wear. His body, which had carried the weight of revelation and the burdens of a nation, was growing frail. It was the 11th year after the migration, and though life in Medina had blossomed with peace and faith, those closest to him sensed a coming change. There was something different in the way he spoke, the way he gazed at the horizon, as if he saw something others could not. Shortly after returning from the farewell pilgrimage, the prophet fell ill. At first it was a fever, intense and consuming, and with it came waves of pain and fatigue. Yet even in sickness he continued to lead the prayers when he could, to offer guidance, to remind his companions of their duty to one another and to God. But the fever did not pass. For days he endured its burning, supported by those who loved him most. He moved from house to house, staying briefly in the homes of his wives, until finally he asked to remain in the room of Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr, and the wife he was closest to in his final years. There, in the simplicity of her room, with its clay walls and woven roof, the final chapter of his earthly life began. He lay upon a mattress stuffed with palm fibers, his head resting against Aisha's chest. She would later remember those days with tears in her eyes, the way his voice weakened, the way he still smiled through his pain, and the way he continued to care for others even as his strength slipped away. At times, he would rise to address the people, urging them to uphold justice, to free the oppressed, to care for the poor. "Do not turn my grave into a place of worship," he warned them. "Those before you went astray when they took the graves of their prophets as places of worship." His concern was never for himself, but for his followers. As his condition worsened, he appointed Abu Bakr to lead the prayers in his place. It was a quiet but powerful gesture, one that signaled to the community who would guide them after his departure. On one morning, just days before his passing, the Prophet gathered his remaining strength and parted the curtain from Aisha's room to watch the Muslims pray in congregation. His eyes lit up with joy at the sight. They were united, standing shoulder to shoulder, just as he had always hoped. He smiled, a smile so pure, so full of peace, that those who saw it would never forget it. It was as if he were saying, "My mission is complete." Then, the final moments came. His breaths grew shallow. Aisha held him close, and he whispered prayers between his lips. With his eyes turned toward the heavens, he spoke his last words. "With the companions of the Most High. With the companions of the Most High." And then his soul returned to its Creator. News of his death spread through Medina like a wave of silence and grief. Many refused to believe it. Umar, one of his closest companions, drew his sword and warned that anyone who claimed Muhammad was dead would be struck down. But Abu Bakr, calm and resolute, stood before the people and spoke the words that would steady a trembling nation. "Whoever worshipped Muhammad, know that Muhammad is dead. But whoever worships Allah, Allah is ever living, never dies." The Prophet's body was washed and wrapped in white cloth by those who had loved him in life and would honor him in death. He was buried in the very room where he passed, in the heart of the city he had built with faith, patience, and love. No monument was erected, no golden tomb or towering shrine, just the quiet resting place of a man who had changed the world, not with wealth or weapons, but with truth, mercy, and unwavering devotion to his Lord. And though he was no longer among them, his presence never left. In the recitation of the Quran, in the prayers of the faithful, in the echoes of justice, and in every heart that followed his path, the light of Muhammad lived on. His return to the Creator was not an end, but the beginning of a legacy that would stretch beyond centuries and borders, a light that would never be extinguished. The Prophet was gone, yet it felt as though he had never left. His footsteps no longer echoed through the streets of Medina, but his presence was still felt in every corner. In the way people greeted one another with peace, in the tears that fell during prayer, in the kindness shown to strangers, the justice upheld in every decision, and the love that bound the community together. His companions, though heartbroken, rose to carry the mission forward, not as mere followers of a man, but as torchbearers of a light that had been entrusted to them. They had watched him live, every word he spoke. They had seen him weep for those who did not believe, comfort those who mourned, stand fearless before tyrants, and smile with humility when praised. He had built no palace, left no treasure, commanded no army of slaves. And yet, his message spread farther and faster than any empire. From the deserts of Arabia to the coasts of Africa, through the valleys of Persia and into the heart of Byzantium, his words crossed every barrier of language, culture, and time. But this light was not only for those who stood beside him, it was for every soul that would one day search for meaning in a world so often lost in shadows. It was for the child who questions the stars, the old man who trembles in prayer, the mother who rocks her baby while whispering divine words, the seeker who stumbles through life looking for a path. It was for every heart broken by injustice, every soul longing to be healed. It was, and always would be, a light for all people. That light lives in the pages of the Quran, where divine wisdom breathes across time, offering solace and strength. It lives in the Prophet's words and actions, preserved not in gold or stone, but in stories retold with love, in hearts transformed by sincerity, in acts of mercy that ripple outward with quiet power. His teachings remain simple yet profound. Feed the hungry, speak the truth, forgive when wronged, stand firm for justice, and walk humbly with your Lord. As centuries passed, rulers rose and fell, civilizations flourished and faded, but the message endured. Mosques were built in lands the prophet never walked. The call to prayer echoed in tongues he never spoke, and millions of hearts bowed in the direction of a city that once tried to silence him. Yet, even now, his name is whispered by the lips of the faithful more times in a single day than perhaps any in history. Not out of habit, but out of love. And that love continues to guide. It teaches people how to treat others with dignity, how to turn pain into patience, and how to transform fear into faith. His life reminds humanity that power lies not in control, but in compassion, that true strength is found in mercy, and that greatness comes not from wealth or bloodline, but from character. The Prophet Muhammad was a man, born of flesh and blood, who walked the earth with bare feet and a heart full of heaven. But the light he brought was eternal. It began in a cave under the watchful stars, and now it glows in the hearts of billions. It lives on in the kindness of strangers, in the courage of the oppressed, in the beauty of every sincere prayer. And as long as there are those who seek truth, who long for justice, who desire to love and be loved by their Creator, that light will never fade. It will burn soft and strong from age to age, calling all who hear it to rise, to reflect, to return, to the one who sent him, and to the message that still whispers across the sands of time: peace, mercy, and light.